Welcome to the Thing About Witch Hunts podcast. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
I'm Sarah Jack. I know why you're watching or listening. It's because in this episode, we're sitting down with Professor Marion Gibson. She's an emeritus professor at Exeter University, and she has built her career recovering the histories of people accused of witchcraft, telling their stories from their point of view whenever possible.
Today, she returns to talk about her newest book, Witchland, a tale of witch hunting and war in 17th century Britain. It follows the English Witchfinder general's witch hunts of the 1640s when the self-proclaimed Witchfinder general Matthew Hopkins and his accomplice, basically, John Stearne, pursued somewhere between 200 and 300 people as witches as England was experiencing a devastating civil war.
Marion writes against what she calls a triple injustice: people punished for a crime no one could commit, then forgotten by the communities that condemned them, then passed over again by historians who fixed their attention on the persecutors. What she restores to them is what was taken, their names, their neighbors, and the texture of their ordinary lives.
We are so glad to welcome her back.
Welcome back, Professor Marion Gibson. You're here to discuss your important new book, Witchland, which is out July 30th in the UK and September 22nd in the US. Has this launch been exciting?
It really is exciting, yeah. This is my second trade book, and I put an awful lot of effort into this one. It's quite wide in its geographical scope, maybe not as wide as the first one, but there was an awful lot of archival research and travelling. So I am so looking forward to sharing it with people.
And it's been a little while since we've had the pleasure of speaking with you. So could you remind us and our audience, any new or returning listeners, about your background and your specialty?
So I am a professor at Exeter University. I no longer work there full time, but I'm still connected to the university. And I teach essentially history and English. And I write about witch trials in history. My first trade book was Witchcraft Act, History in 13 Trials, which you were kind enough to talk to me about already. And this is the second one, Witchland, which is subtitled A Tale of Witch Hunting and War in 17th Century Britain. And what I like to do is to try to recover as far as possible the stories of accused people and tell the stories as much as possible from their point of view.
Why this enormous feat? Why this book on the witch hunting and the wartime?
Yeah, sometimes I wonder why I set myself these enormous tasks. But I always want to know every last thing that I can about the people who were accused of witchcraft. I feel like we owe it to them, even though they are long gone. I want to know what they ate for breakfast. I want to know what they saw when they looked out of their windows. I want to know who their sister was. I want to know what happened to them and where it happened to them. I wanted to tell the story of what is often known as the Witchfinder general witch hunt of the British Civil Wars, so the 1640s. And it's usually known as the Witchfinder general hunt because the Witchfinder, Matthew Hopkins, gave himself this title, Witchfinder general, and he and a colleague, John Stearne, hunted down somewhere between 200 and 300, possibly more, people as witches during the 1640s, at a time when Britain was embroiled in a civil war, which I think is really important in making people suspicious, making people frightened, making people turn on their neighbours, and also empowered the witchfinders as well, because they were able to operate essentially outside of many of the usual constraints of British life and British courtrooms. I wanted to tell this story as much as possible from the viewpoint of the accused people and some of the ordinary accusers. And as I went through the story, I also realised I wanted to tell the story of those who tried to defend the accused people. I thought these were all more worthy subjects than the witchfinders were. Their story's been told. Really interestingly, a lot of research has been done on them. John Stearne and Matthew Hopkins are famous figures, but what about the people they persecuted? Could we know more about them? And this book is the result of finding out more about them and sharing their stories.
One of the things that pops out of the very beginning that I think is really important is to recognize what you called the triple historical injustice. I'd love to know a little bit more about that.
Well, first of all, the people accused of witchcraft. which they couldn't have done. So that seems to me the basic injustice that happened to them during their lives. They were accused and they were punished for that. Afterwards, their communities often forgot about them. So again, we have this story of the Witchfinders, which is quite widely known, especially across Eastern England, where a lot of the action of this book happens. So their stories get told, but quite often the communities where people are persecuted couldn't tell you their names. And I wanted to give them those stories back. And then finally, historians, as I was just saying, really, have often overlooked the accused people in order to focus more on their accusers and those who persecuted them. And that just, it feels like three injustices all rolled into one. And I wanted to try and do something about that.
We really ran into those three with our work in New England, especially in Connecticut. And I could not have articulated it 4 years ago when I was looking for acknowledgement of Alice Young. But those were the things that hid her story. Our first woman that was hanged here in the U.S. So
yes, yeah, that's right. Yes, and recovering those stories feels so important. So many of these people are just one name, sometimes a surname, sometimes just like Alice, a forename and a surname, sometimes a date, sometimes nothing more than that. And it just doesn't feel like it's enough, really. When we have all these new digitized ways of searching, there are much more opportunities to get to digital records. Record offices are more open than they have been for a long time over the past 20 years or so. So why not go into the archives? Why not dig through the internet and see what you can find about these people?
And why was there so much witch hunting activity? Why were there so many witch trials in the 1640s in Britain?
I think the Civil War has a lot to do with it. As you will know, witch trials have already been up and running in Britain since the 1560s at least. There are some medieval cases, which I'm sure you know about. But once legislation is passed in the 1560s, what we might think of as the era of the witch trials in Great Britain, so England and Scotland particularly. It's been going on for some time, but because in the 1640s, the nations that make up the British Isles fall into civil war internally amongst themselves and also against each other from time to time, it feels like that's an important driver of these witch hunts. It's a period of massive dislocation, a lot of religious conflict, which always sparks off witch hunts, a lot of political conflict. People are fearful. There's a lot of refugees. I found it really interesting looking at the Civil War from the perspective of today. The landscape of England and Scotland is covered in people migrating from one place to another because they've been displaced by war. And some of that really feels very modern, and I wanted to try and get people to think about what it might have been like to live through the British Civil Wars and why people might have turned on scapegoats like witches because there was really nothing they could do to stop fighting coming to their town or to stop people being driven into their town from elsewhere. It was a time when people had lost control of their lives, and I think the witch hunt comes out of that in large part.
You shared a quote from the Register that I thought it says so much that someone wrote this down. All things in this nation being in confusion. It really just kind of sewed up what you're saying about the impact of this war.
It's a great phrase, isn't it? The totality of it is really interesting. And as you say, somebody took the trouble to write that down. So they were writing their parish register where normally they record the baptisms and marriages and funerals of the inhabitants. And across a great deal of the country, people stopped recording that stuff. So you've got this big gap in the records in a lot of communities. And somebody was angry enough about that to write down, this is because everything's broken. This is why there's this big gap in our lives. This is why everything is such a mess. And that phrase, I think, does sum it up.
You wrote about a very important case of a woman whose identity was lost. Can you give us a little teaser about the Witch of Newbury?
I can. So I start the book with her. And she's a nameless woman. We were talking about Alice Young. At least she's got a name. This woman doesn't even have a name, and I'm not able to assign one to her after all this time either. But I thought, nevertheless, it was important to start with her story because this is a woman who was shot by soldiers during the Civil Wars. And I wanted to look at how that would have happened to her. So there are some news pamphlets published about it. And we can find out a little bit more about her and what she's supposed to have said. She's supposed to basically come up to the soldiers at one of the battlefields, the Battle of Newbury, 1643. Newbury's in the south of England, and it was one of those places in the middle of the country that people fought over quite a bit. So there was a second Battle of Newbury a while afterwards. But this is the first one. And this one was supposed to have come up to the battlefield perhaps because she was just a local woman. And some soldiers spotted her apparently walking on water, which seems quite a surprising thing for her to do. And they concluded that she was a witch, and they hauled her before their commander and had her questioned. And then, I'm sorry to say, they had her shot. And there's this really interesting story about her, part of which has to be made up, and part of which is perhaps true. It seems fairly likely there was a real woman. There are enough sources reporting it for us to think, yeah, that probably did happen. And it's basically the story of a battlefield atrocity against somebody who was accused of witchcraft. And I thought that was a great place to start the story of the relationship between witchcraft accusations and the civil wars. So, yeah, we start with the Witch of Newbury and we go on from there.
The 1604 Witchcraft Act had a big impact on what they were able to prosecute, even though they were, as you said, that word constraint came out a lot when I was reading. But when you talk about they didn't have the usual constraints, but then the other part that you really show with the accused and especially the women, there were constraints but expectations. That was so powerful. So I wanted to say that. The Witchcraft Act of 1604 really contributed to the witch panic. Can you help us understand that?
Yeah, so there was a Witchcraft Act in the 1560s, which criminalised witchcraft, made it a crime that could go through the state courts, basically. But it wasn't really thought to be strong enough. And so in 1604, a new Witchcraft Act is brought in that proposes stronger penalties for the crime and pulls more activities into the area of really heavy penalties, which of course included execution by hanging. So the Witchcraft Act of 1604 sets up the kind of landscape of the 1640s. That's the act under which the people of the 1640s witch hunt were prosecuted. And one of the things that it focuses on most, or at least response to it focuses on most, is the idea of contact with spirits. So it wasn't just that you were being accused of, say, harming your neighbours or plotting against the monarch or something like that, which you could very well be accused of before 1604. Instead, you could be accused simply of having contact with evil spirits, of keeping a familiar spirit, maybe in the form of a little animal or something of that nature. And that really opens up the possibility of prosecuting people for almost nothing. It's not being said, oh, they were treasure hunting, or they did some love magic, or they harmed Mrs. So-and-so who lived down the road from them, or they killed these animals. All of those things are in the mix in the 1640s. But when you boil it right down, people can be accused simply because somebody says, oh, she had an evil spirit. And that was enough, and people could be hanged for that. And again, I think that's really important. So we have not only the Civil War, all the dysfunctions, dislocations of the Civil War. We've not only got the idea in this society that witchcraft exists and somebody ought to do something about it. We've also got a law that is much more permissive than previous laws, and which can be interpreted in this period in the most permissive way possible, so that people can be prosecuted for virtually nothing. And I think that is what builds towards this mass witch hunt and means that so many hundreds of people are involved.
And with those animal spirits, the accused individuals who were telling about them often gave them nice, familiar pet names. But the people who were accusing them of having spirits were depicting those animals as causing harm and murder and damage. I find that very interesting that you have that dichotomy there. What can we read into that?
I think the familiar spirits are one of those questions that historians go back to over and over again and think, what? What is going on here? They're a really broad range in this period. Probably used to the idea that there are cats and dogs who are animal familiars. That's pretty common from the earlier period. You get the odd toad or rat or something like that. But in this period, perhaps because there is such a mass hunt and there are so many people answering questions about familiar spirits, you get all sorts of other creatures drawn in. You get bumblebees, you get flies, you get human beings. The devil comes in the form of a spirit. You get the dogs and cats, you get rabbits, you get bizarre hybrid creatures with an ox's head and a dog's body, which subsequently turns into a child. You get all of this kind of stuff. And they also get it mixed up with fairy beliefs as well. So some of them seem to think that there are these sort of changeling children who are something to do with familiar spirits. So I like you. I find the whole thing really interesting and also really puzzling. Why do people confess to this? In some cases, maybe they have a pet and they're describing that. But in other cases, they appear to be just freely fantasizing about what kind of contact they might have had with the devil and what that might mean to them. A number of them also say they were married to the devil as well. So you get this kind of, it feels like there's a sort of free association of ideas going on here. So children become demonic contacts of some kind. The devil is there as a lover. The devil is there as an animal. The whole thing is just this kind of free-form thing that's going on in people's minds. And that's at least partly because they're basically, by modern standards, being tortured. Again, in earlier witch trials, you don't get that. But in the 1640s, a number of people have the great idea of depriving the suspects of sleep and also keeping them constantly in motion or holding them still, maybe standing on a stool or something like that. And of course, that kind of physical and mental stress makes people much more likely to start hallucinating all sorts of strange creatures and strange responses to questions about familiars. So with these trials, it feels like the familiars, the animal familiars, the human familiars are central, but also that they're in a sense more puzzling than ever because they're more crazy in what they're saying. And it's really fascinating and horrifying to see.
It is. They represent a comfort and they represent community to the accused person in a sense, but then your witch finders are using it to prove this devil conspiracy against the church. What is lost when these clergy are looking for the enemy like this?
I think all sorts of things are lost which are to do with what Christianity is supposed to be about. As the epigraph of the book, I put a quote from a Baptist minister who was one of the people who ultimately ended up defending somebody who was accused of witchcraft towards the end of the book in Newcastle in the north of England. And his quote is basically, why do people hate each other so much? We're all God's children. What is wrong with you? And I thought that was a really nice way of summing up what was lost. And what was lost was a sense of fellowship and compassion and humane behaviour to one another. This is the absolute antithesis of people loving their neighbour. And all that they are doing is pursuing their neighbour across this landscape of civil war, attempting to get them killed and using them in the most inhumane manner possible. So physically torturing their bodies and minds. They didn't think of it as torture. Torture was prohibited under English law in these type of cases. So they just thought that they were helping people to confess. They were helping people to access this sin that they'd committed and fess up to it. But of course, that wasn't the case at all. And the fact that a lot of the people doing the questioning are some of the most religious people in their community, it won't surprise you to discover they are often people who would self-identify as the godly and who other people call Puritans, who are the people who later emigrate to what will become the United States. These are the questioners. These are the people doing the hounding and persecuting rather than attempting to defend those who are clearly innocent and are being put under tremendous pressure to effectively incriminate themselves and be killed. It's a very, very depressing story about religiosity. But I did want to remind people at the beginning of the book that religion is not supposed to be about this, and that some religious people did stand against this. And I think that's quite important to remember.
Yeah, in the religious area, I know there were reformers working in the country trying to reform the church, and there were also traditionalists who liked the way things were. And what will readers of Witchland learn about the politics of the reformers and the traditionalists?
Enough to help them understand the stories of witch trials, I think. I've tried to strike a balance between telling people a load of stuff about that really interesting question, who was trying to reform the church and why, and what kind of groups were there, and who was trying to defend it and say that it was fine the way it was and why, and at the same time not overwhelming people with so much information about different sectarian groups and different practices, different beliefs. So there's enough for you to understand the stories and to see the conflict between reformers and traditionalists, in which reformers often do become the witch hunters, but not so much that you'll think, oh dear, I need to know what an Anabaptist is, as opposed to, say, a Quaker. Don't worry about any of that. You can look that up later. But I think it's important to see, as you say, Josh, that conflict as being central to this. People who want things to stay the way they are, and people who are insistent that there must be change. And somewhere along the way, they drop the ball on that idea that reform is for good and will make everybody more pious and godly. And instead, they end up turning Britain into this free-for-all for witch hunters.
How does this collection of stories contribute to the context of the English witch trial history?
I think these are really important, and there's surprisingly little written about them. There are books about the Witchfinders, and you'll often find these witch trials referenced in longer accounts of the English or the Scottish witch hunt or whatever. But actually, because there were so many communities affected, and there are so many records one could look at to tell the story, I think people have kind of reeled away from it in horror. And I was lucky that I got a grant from the Leverhulme Trust, which is a British charitable trust, that allowed me to work with Tabitha Stanmore, who I think is well known to you on this podcast, and for us to go to all the repositories of records and try to track down as many records as we could. And we had 3 years to do it. But even so, there is just so much still out there. And I think that's put people off telling this story. In one of the counties, for example, in Suffolk County in eastern England, there were 31 different communities affected. And that's just the ones we know about. Tabitha is writing a book on some of the Fenland counties, so some of the counties a bit further north and east, up the east coast of England. And I hope you want to talk to her about that later on when that comes out. And again, we could have written book after book about this. So I think people haven't told the story perhaps because it's such a big story. But I felt like if you picked out communities where you could tell a really interesting story and where there were enough records surviving to be able to talk about individuals, that it was a story that could be told in a single book and we could see where we went with it, really.
Sarah and I were talking yesterday about how each chapter could be its own book at the least, if not multiple books per chapter. But you don't overload people with the information. It's a really nice balance. It's a good read. I picked it up and could hardly put it down. But how did you manage to encapsulate an entire decade of witch trials with the stories that you chose?
I'm glad that it came across that way. Yes, throughout, I was really conscious that there was an awful lot of stuff that could go in. And I had to hold myself back quite a bit from going into some of that detail. So I'm glad. I wanted it to be a pacey narrative and for people to really feel with the accused witches and with some of the accusers and with some of the defenders, and to really feel like this was a story that spoke directly to them and wasn't burdened down by a load of stuff about religion and politics and so on, but where they understood there was a religious and political context. What I've tried to do in selecting the stories is to tell stories from right across Britain. So there is a concentration on the east of England because that was where most of the trials in England were held, and that's where the famous Witchfinder General and his accomplice came from. But I also tell a story about Scotland. I tell a story about the north of England, Newcastle. I tell a story about Cornwall in the far west. And I tell this story about Berkshire, the Witch of Newbury as well. So I tried to balance it so there was something about most of the parts of the UK as it now is that would hopefully inspire people to go and look in their own locality and see what was going on in the 1640s, and to hold off on doing too much on the eastern counties, because I felt there was a wider story to be told here that would help people understand what was going on. So I am glad you feel it worked, because yes, my goodness, I sweated over this thing.
It really should strike a match on getting people to rediscover their local history. You talk about that a little bit in your book, how significant that is, rediscovering locally. And yeah, you're accomplishing so much with this book. And you walk away knowing the people from the stories because of what you were able to share in their stories. So thank you. What were these accusations? What witchcraft was happening?
I don't know what was really happening, but what the accusations are, they often boil down, as I was saying earlier, just to the idea that people are keeping spirits. But you do also get stories of people who come forward and say, I've suffered some kind of individual harm. So, say the little town of Framlingham in Suffolk, for example. You get this whole slew of kind of mid-ranking people, really quite powerful individuals in the community. You know, people who are church wardens, people who are supervisors of roads, people who are local councillors, you know, selectmen, as you might think of them in other contexts. People who feel like they're in charge of the community and they're doing all the work in the community, but there are witches and the witches are working against them. And those people come forward to tell stories of the death of their children, of their spouses becoming sick, of losses of animals, of losses of livelihood, of harm that's come to them, of mysterious illnesses that have afflicted them. And that is really the kind of meat and drink of the witchcraft accusations that we've seen in Britain since the 1560s, repurposed for the Civil War period, if you like. So you get accusations of real harm, but you also get this sort of nebulous idea that there are loads of witches out there and that almost you can point the finger at anybody and they will be accused.
One thing I found very interesting in it, when you're talking about the Essex witch hunt specifically, and then the 7 counties, it wasn't just Matthew Hopkins and John Stearne who were involved in persecuting and evaluating people for whether they were witches. What could you tell us about the basically committees of watchers and other people who were volunteering to or being paid to investigate?
Yeah, this unfortunately isn't just an enterprise of 2 witchfinders. So one of the things which again helps to transform these accusations into a mass witch hunt is that the community really gets on board with it. So people come forward volunteering and they say, if you're going to inspect these people, if you're going to keep them in motion all night and you're going to deprive them of sleep, I'll help. I'll come along. I'll watch them. I'll see if their familiar spirits come. It's so sad that it's all devoted to this hideous torture because there seems a genuine community spirit here and people want to come forward and they want to improve their communities and make them more pious and godly and they want to root out criminality and they want to be on guard against the attacks of the devil. But the way that expresses it is they're going to watch their neighbour run up and down a room all night until they're so tired they can no longer think. And then they're going to prod and poke them and force them to confess to witchcraft. So they get help. They get these, as you say, committees of watchers. They get people who are willing to come forward and volunteer to inspect the bodies of the accused people to see if they can find any marks on them, which might suggest the devil has been in contact with them and has left a mark on their body. They're men and they're women. It's an equal opportunities witch hunt from that point of view. Women get involved to a large extent. And you also get other religious figures involved too. Sometimes a rector or a vicar will step forward to get involved. That happens in one of the first cases in a village called Lawford in Essex that we're mentioning, that the Essex hunt. This is where it all starts. There's the Witch of Newbury, an isolated case, but one which shows, I think, the direction in which Britain is travelling. But it isn't until Hopkins and Stearne and their committees and this rector, John Eads, step forward to organising the formal examination of supposed witches and then start spreading the idea across their county of Essex that other communities could set up these watching committees and other places could start looking for witchcraft. It isn't until that happens that it really takes off. So yeah, loads of other people volunteering to come in from all walks of life, really. Bricklayers, farmers, housewives. It's a free-for-all. It's appalling. But it's also really, really fascinating because I think it shows us how easy it is for that kind of scapegoating to take hold in a community and for people who in other circumstances might be perfectly reasonable to get on board with it.
Yeah, they're not looking to determine whether they're a witch. They're looking to show how they are. They're an enemy at that point. And it is hard because there's so many other ways that community compassion is evident, but in this, they're abandoning these vulnerable people into this horror. And it's interesting that the Witchfinders did write their own books, so we have their lens, but there were accounts from some survivors that really show us what they were experiencing.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. There's a Scottish case where a woman called Margaret Thompson, who I talk about in the book, actually starts suing those and complaining about those who have tortured her. And so she tells us, I was made to strip off my clothes in the vestry of my local church. I was made to stand on a stool for 26 days and nights while people beat me and told me I was a witch and tried to force me to confess. And that kind of testimony is really powerful.
And a lot of the confessions, of course, were coerced. What patterns were there emerging from what the people were saying when they were forced to say these things?
There are patterns, and I think that's related to the questioning. So you can see, for example, as Hopkins and Stearne move across Essex, go into Suffolk, go into Norfolk, go into the Midlands, to Northamptonshire, that they take the same questions with them. So you will often find people confessing to very similar things, and that is usually something along the lines of the person saying that they met the devil, that the devil tempted them, that he asked them to give him their soul, that he gave them an animal familiar, maybe he became their lover, maybe he tempted them in other ways by saying you can have some wealth or you get revenge on the people who you hate. And then sometimes there are stories that really do seem to be direct echoes. So, for example, people are saying, well, I married the devil. And that happens to a woman called Rebecca West in Essex. And then later on, it happens to a woman called Ellen Driver in Suffolk. And you think, come on, this isn't coincidence. This is because Matthew Hopkins is questioning both of these people, isn't it? And probably lists of questions are given to others. People develop over time this story that they tell themselves, a narrative that they tell themselves about witchcraft. And so, of course, they put this narrative to all of the accused people, and the accused people essentially just have to say yes and no, which in their exhausted and wretched state it would be easy for them to do. They just have to confirm it, and so the story builds, and that is what people come to believe every witch does, and that's how it works for everybody. Of course, you do get circumstances where you feel like the accused person has some more input. A woman, Ellen Driver, she says, I had these two children, but they were familiars and they were like changelings. And over time, they sort of ran away. They went away. I don't know what happened to them. And she says, I married the devil, but he died. And then looking at the parish register, you realise her husband has died. And she's probably talking about that as part of her confession. But of course, it's interpreted as she's saying, well, I married the devil and I had a pact with him and I gave him my soul. And these children who went away or died or whatever happened to them, those are my familiar spirits. Everything is read in the context of this narrative. And as you were saying, Sarah, they are looking to confirm that people are witches rather than trying to find out whether they are witches or not. And that's the narrative that they build over time.
And they went to Great Yarmouth, and that location means a lot to Josh and I and a lot of other descendants, because we know Rebecca Nurse was baptized there, and she's my ancestor. It was really amazing to read about the town, and the way you open that chapter, I just hung on every word, and I even read a portion to my colleague, Mary. We had a business meeting last night, and I was like, let me read a few paragraphs to you out of this book. So,
oh, that's lovely. I'm so glad. I loved writing that. I loved going to Great Yarmouth and imagining what that place was like. It is very different now. The fishing industry has basically collapsed because of climate change, because of movements of fish, because of overfishing and so on. And it's a very different place now. But if you could think yourself back into the 17th century when it was this unbelievably crowded, thriving, lively, vibrant community where people are just falling over each other because they're all jammed onto this little sand spit next to the River Yar, between the river and the sea. It's absolute powder keg. It's an amazing community. And it doesn't surprise me at all that people like Rebecca Nurse and Mary Eastie, her sister, and all the other Salem descendants come out of this place. I found a lot of the communities, Framlingham, for example, in Suffolk that I was talking about earlier, they were also places from where people emigrated to America. And you can find the same names, you can find the same sons of thought. They just travel across the Atlantic and move right on. And of course, that ends up with trials like the Connecticut witch trials and the Salem witch trials. So yeah, there's absolutely a connection between the English communities in particular that I talk about in the book and the communities of America's East Coast, which they'll become just a few decades later.
I know when I was looking up the Witch of Newbury to see, I wanted to look at that cover art on the pamphlet about her with her riding the plank boat. It's a very interesting image, but I had to specify that it was Newbury, England that I was talking about and not Newbury, Massachusetts, because I have this aunt, Elizabeth Morse, who was accused of witchcraft in Newbury, Massachusetts. Yeah.
Yes, I know about that case. Yeah, absolutely. And you can really see the connections, can't you? The people in England accused somebody in this place with this name, and then later people emigrated to the eastern seaboard of the States, and they took with them their beliefs as well as everything else, and they took with them the name of their community and plopped it down on the landscape. And then over time, they had some witch trials.
And I was thinking about how the courts in New England clearly followed some authoritative manuals on identifying witches. The Governor William Jones authored a formal document called Grounds for Examination of a Witch. Were manuals like this being used in the 1640s or at any time over there?
Yes, I think they were. Matthew Hopkins says that he's read King James's book Demonology, for example. So we know that's somewhere in the mix of the ideas he has about this narrative of witchcraft that he and John Stearne and the others are building together. It's not entirely clear which, as it were, manuals were used for which cases. They also seem to be freestyling a little bit and making up things as they go along, which is particularly alarming, I think. But yes, absolutely, they are drawing on some of the cases that they already know about. And I think if people know any of my earlier books, the academic books that I wrote before I started writing trade history books, you can look at some of the cases there and see, oh yeah, they've actually read that news pamphlet from 1590 something. And now here it is. They're almost quoting from it in the 1640s and saying, have you done this? Some of the communities are places where there's been a previous witch trial in the 1560s and the 1580s. And you can see the influence of that. And again, that's often through a news pamphlet or people's kind of folk memory of what happened there. So there are templates, yes, they are using templates in this witch hunt.
Were there differences in how the witchfinders in Scotland were identifying witches than the ones in England?
Yes, there are. Scotland's a really important part of this story. I think the witch hunt in some ways starts there, although it also starts in eastern England, as I said. But one of the things that the Scottish witch hunters this period are doing is pioneering some of these as effectively torture techniques. So this woman, Margaret Thompson, who had to stand on a stool in her church for all this length of time while people abused her and questioned her. She's in Scotland, and I think that some of that idea about how you interrogate a witch drifts south with religious radicals who are drawing on the Scottish example. Scotland's a lot more radical than England in some ways in its religiosity. That's really important, I think. And also, you get this idea in Scotland that witches can be discovered by pricking their bodies with a pin. It's not unheard of in England, but it does seem to be a really specifically Scottish thing that is often done to suspects there. And people are being pricked to see if there's a mark on their body that doesn't feel any pain. So what they call an insensible mark. And that's thought to be where the devil has touched them. He's marked them, he's kind of baptized them, blessed them, and made them into witches. So these poor people are being stabbed and poked all over by witch prickers, as they're called in Scotland, in an attempt to find that they are witches. And you find towards the end of the book, when there's a witch trial in Newcastle, which is right next to the Scottish border, you find that happening there. And that is because they literally called in a Scottish expert who was a witch pricker and said, why don't you come south across the border and come and assault people in our community as well with these pins? He seems like an utter fraud, that man. We don't know who he was. We don't have a name for him. But the accounts of people can judge for themselves when they read the book. But it just seems to me that what he's doing is pretending to stick a pin in people and then acting all surprised when they don't feel that the pin has entered their flesh and when they don't bleed. So yeah, that's a specifically Scottish practice, but it does spread. And I think one of the things the book's kind of about is how ideas spread across the country and then how they spread transatlantically to another country as well. People get these ideas in their head, they get these conspiracy theories, and then they just trot around the world spreading them. And that feels really quite modern too.
It is modern. When you look at the witch trials in New England, versions of these trial examinations and fragments, like Margaret Jones, we know she was watched, but we don't know if anybody else was. George Jacobs Sr. was pricked, but the women during the Salem witch trials were examined for those demonic marks. So it's interesting how what they reported.
These ideas travel, but also people keep silent about them sometimes. I think they traveled more widely than we know because people didn't always say what they were doing to the suspects. And you can understand why they'd be a bit reticent about that.
Yeah.
How significant is it that a 6-year-old grew up to write his own account of fairies and a witch trial that happened 50 years before?
Yeah, oh, he's great, isn't he? I think he's really significant. So this is a guy called Moses Pitt. And Moses turns up towards the end of the book in a story about Cornwall. So looking at the west of England as opposed to the east, which we spent quite a bit of time thinking about. And Moses has a nurse called Anne Jeffries. And this nurse starts saying that she can see fairies and that the fairies give her healing abilities. And she starts making prophecies supposedly given to her by the fairies. And little Moses, yes, he's a really small boy. And this must have seemed like the most amazing and magical thing to him. But the magistrates and the other people in his community are not sure about what Anne is saying. And some of them start to think that far from being some kind of blessed godly healer working with God's fairies, she's actually a witch. So she is accused and involved in a witch trial, and Moses has to give evidence in this witch trial. And years later, he looks back on this. I loved writing that chapter. I think it's just this wonderful retrospect of somebody living in the 1690s, looking back to the 1640s and remembering his childhood and thinking, oh, yeah, there were those witch trials, weren't there? And there was that weird thing that happened with my nurse. What was that? And I love telling that story because it's a story of hope in a lot of ways. We've talked a lot about bad things that happen to people in the book, and yes, they do. But there are also stories of hope, and that's one of them. That story has an outcome that you don't expect. And I found it quite a happy story. Moses was remembering the witch trial, not as some kind of hideous, torturing, persecutory, terrible thing that happened in the dark past of the Civil War. He's remembering it as something amazing that happened to him when he was a small boy. And I just think that's really nice. And it gives readers, I guess, a kind of, it's one of those moments where you talk about those who defended the witches. Not all communities turned on people and tore them limb from limb. Some communities thought, actually, we're not having this. We don't really want to hold a witch trial here. And the Cornish community is one of those. I think they come out of it pretty well, considering, although there were other witch trials in Cornwall, nobody was exempt. But yeah, I think he's really significant. And I think his story about Anne Jeffries and the fairies is really significant because it reminds you about just what a supernatural world people lived in. If they weren't thinking about witches, they were thinking about fairies or goblins or ghosts or angels. There was all this other stuff going on in their minds that we might not think about today. But you imagine this is a kind of haunted, magical world, and you start to see why witch trials might happen.
And these memorable relationships were growing and blooming within it. I really liked Moses' story because often the children in these stories are harmed, suffering, missing. So it was really, I felt like it was just a great opportunity to see his experience. As an adult, he's sharing it, but
I think so. There's him and his little sister. And I think throughout the chapter, you're thinking, oh no, that's going to happen. But yeah, it's fine. They remember it as this kind of amazing experience where they met or very nearly met the fairies.
Very new. Yeah.
When you were doing your research and traveling around, did you find any local memorials to the victims of the witch trials?
I did find some. I'm most in favour of memorials. I would like to see more of them. I would like every one of these communities to have it, at least just a little plaque saying, these people are accused here. It's really bad. This is what happened to them. But yes, I did. I found them in Great Yarmouth. There's a little plaque on the churchyard gate there. I found them in Manningtree in Essex, where a new plaque had been put up in, I think, 2023, really relatively recently, explaining what happened there. There's been in Newcastle quite a lot of effort to recover the story of the witch trials there, and historians are telling this story. Members of the community, journalists are getting involved in telling the story, and there is increasing interest in memorialising these people. So I did find memorials. I think these trials are being remembered more and more. And partly that's because people are just really interested in the history of witch trials at the moment. We've been having this kind of magical moment where people have become really excited about the history of magic and the supernatural for several decades now, which I think is great. But also, we do live in kind of persecutory times, and I think people are encouraged to think about persecutions of the past when they see persecution happening around them, or they are worried about political directions, or they're worried about polarization of society and political conflict and the kind of drift to war. And I think we're experiencing all of those things now. We don't want to be, but we look back at history and we find times when that was happening in the past, and we want to know more about it. And maybe, yes, we want to put up a memorial to at least show people that we remember.
Yeah, and hopefully we're not going to be in 40 years, 80 years, well, we won't be, but new memorials for horrendous acts. You want these memorials to remind us that we don't want more. But
Yeah.
I think it's such a place to just reflect and remember the people. I think we need that opportunity whenever possible. And then there's so much opportunity to learn about their stories now. So they go hand in hand.
I think they do. A memorial can prompt further research as well as reflection. And I really want people to go to their own community archives to see if they can find out more about these people. Because I've only been able to tell a very small proportion of stories in this book, as we were saying earlier, across this mass witch hunt. And as you will know, all around the world, there were cases of witch hunting. There are still cases of witch hunting. People can find out about them if they want to.
When and how can people buy the book?
As you were saying, it comes out on the 30th of July in Britain. I cannot comment on import tariffs or any of that stuff. So people will have to do their own research about whether or not they can buy it in other countries. But it will come out in North America, and I'm very much looking forward to that. And it will have that lovely cover that we can see behind Sarah there now, which has this amazing pink broom on it. And it's just lovely. It has a sort of spectral treescape behind it. I think it's a beautiful cover. The British cover and the sort of British and Commonwealth cover is beautiful because it's bright pink. But also the cover of the North American edition is lovely, and it has this kind of amazing pink highlight on it. So people should look out for it. I think it's going to be the kind of book that you see across the bookstore and you think, oh, what's that? And that's what I want to happen. I want people to be drawn in, even if they think, oh, you know what, the Civil War, I don't really want to know about that. Or, oh, witches, another book about witches, what's this? But go and have a look. Go and have a look at the amazing cover design, and then open the book and see if the stories in it are for you.
And they are. And that cover is so beautiful. And it's like a point of pride when you have that book in your hand and you have this pink broom on there. You're carrying this beautiful art and you have this broom with you. It's so fun. What is up next for you?
Lots of things, actually. Now I don't teach full time anymore. I have more time to write books. Great. So I'm researching a couple of things. I'm researching some more witch trials because over the years I've found cases here and there which are not connected in the way that this big witch hunt is connected, but which are nevertheless stories worth telling in their own right. So I'm looking at some of those across Britain at the moment, and some of them in the West, where again there's been less research done than in the East of Britain. So I'm looking at that. I'm thinking about writing a book about the history of books as well, which might be quite fun. And I think maybe there are other ways of telling these stories and making people think about how ideas of witchcraft and magic and the supernatural are still relevant today and are still present in modern fantasy and the way that we think about the world. So I'm sort of experimenting with a whole range of different books, and they're all growing together. And it's just so exciting. I think there's a lot more to be said and done about this. So if people like Witchland, there may be other books coming along that they might like as well. I hope so. Anyway.
Yeah, Witchland is just such a phenomenal piece of work. It's such a wonderfully written book and definitely extraordinarily well researched. So we recommend it highly to anybody. It's a joy to read. It's a great pleasure to read the book.
I'm so glad you said that. Thank you. It's still making its way in the world, and it's lovely when people find something in it for them. I'm really pleased. Thank you for inviting me on to talk about it. It's always a pleasure to talk to you guys about witches.
Thank you so much, Professor Gibson.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Gibson, for the remarkable work you poured into Witchland and for walking us through it today, from the Nameless Witch of Newbury to Little Moses Pitt and his fairies.
These are the conversations we love to have, tracing how the fear that gripped 1640s Britain crossed the Atlantic and took root in the towns our own ancestors called home, where witch trials began in the 1640s in New England. The book Witchland is out now in the UK, with the North American edition coming up in September. Order your copy at bookshop.org/shop/inwitchhunts.